Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over the destructuring syntax in JavaScript. This is a slightly newer operator or syntax in JavaScript that works with arrays and objects and a few other iterables. And it's a nice follow-up to the spread syntax video earlier where we kind of saw how a new version of the language allows us to kind of do something previously that was a bit more cumbersome. So the same is true with destructuring. It allows us to do something that was previously available in the language, except it's just much neater and much more concise syntax. And we're going to see this pop up everywhere as we start working with the language more in the future. So that said, let's get right into destructuring. All right, so I have a whole bunch of slides prepared as usual. I want to kind of go over this concept to start of destructuring assignment and then destructuring binding or patterns. So this video is really going to focus on destructuring assignment, which mainly works in two kind of ways. One is with arrays and one is with objects. So this is pretty similar to kind of what we saw with the spread syntax as well. I do want to kind of note for sake of completion though, that there are these other ways to use destructuring, which we're actually going to use quite a lot. However, for sake of brevity for this video, and since a lot of this is kind of related to this concept right here, as long as we understand the concepts for how it works with arrays and objects, we should be good to go for when we see it pop up with things like for loops, function parameters, and even in some cases, try-catch blocks. So let's just take a look at arrays and objects in this video, and let's start with arrays. So what does destructuring allow us to do? So let's say that we have something like what I have on this slide. We have a const cities, which is pointing at this array right here. So in this array, it's an array of strings, in this case, cities, okay? Cairo, Tehran, Beijing, and Madrid. What we can do with destructuring is we can actually use the array syntax on the left-hand side of an assignment, right? And an assignment being an equal sign. So what we're saying here is take cities, which is this array, and we want to assign these new variables based on whatever this is. So what does that mean? So when we have these square brackets on the left-hand side of an assignment, that is what destructuring is for destructuring array syntax. And in this case, what we're saying is please create 4 variables: Cairo, Tehran, Beijing, and Madrid. Now I named these the same as the string, so hopefully that's not too confusing. But what I want to show is that these are variables in the second line here, and they're going to match up in place with every single value inside of the array, which is on the right-hand side. Okay, so since we have 4 values in our array, and we're destructuring it into 4 variables on the left-hand side, each of these is going to get assigned one of those strings, which are the values inside of that starting array. So if we were to log out Cairo, Tehran, Beijing, and Madrid, we would get the actual resulting string values. Okay, so let's take a look at this kind of in practice and code, and then we'll add to it as we go. So I'm going to call this array-intro.js, which makes it a little bit bigger to start. And I'm going to say, I'll go with kind of the same example, right? I'll say const cities, and we'll say, let's go with a few different cities here. Let's go with Vancouver. Let's go with Mexico City. Let's go with Toronto. My mind is blanking. I'm just going to go with a bunch of Canadian cities, I guess, and we'll go with London. And then for fun, for now, I'll just actually make this kind of a bit more complex example so we can play around with it in the future. I'm just going to add one more city here. Let's go with Berlin. Okay. So what is kind of the purpose of destructuring? We can grab values out of this array. So let's think of this really quick. Before we have destructuring, what could we do? We could say const Vancouver, for example, is equal to cities at 0, right? So if I console.log out Vancouver, in this case, we're actually going to see the string Vancouver. So let me kind of pull up my sidebar here. Let me show them the right folder and run node array intro. And you can see Vancouver pops up, right? Nothing too fancy there. So we could kind of do the same thing, right? We could kind of say const, let's just go Mexico City. This one's a bit trickier since it's camel case. Oh no. And we'll say cities at 1, right? So you can kind of see, right? This is, it's functional. It works. We have the language to do this, right? But it kind of is pretty annoying, right? There's a lot of repetition here, especially on the right-hand side. We keep saying const, for example, right? So it'd be cool if we had a way to kind of do this, but with destructuring. So that's what destructuring is. So if I kind of comment these out really quick, just so that we can kind of have a comparison up here, I can do the same thing. I can say Vancouver, and then I can say Mexico City, right? And this is going to equal to whatever is in cities. Okay, so this might look a bit strange because now you might be wondering, well, what about all the Toronto and London and Berlin? What's happening with them? Well, let's take a look at this to start and kind of take it from there. So with Mexico City and with Vancouver, if I was to run this, we'll see that we actually get those printed out, right? So hopefully, just even with this simple example, you can kind of see, what do you prefer, right? Do you prefer this or do you prefer doing this? Now, I think most people would probably say they prefer this, and that is why kind of destructuring came about. And this is a pattern that we're going to see come up quite a lot as we do development, especially things with like React, for example, and many other frameworks. Okay, so let's kind of ignore the fact of what happens to Toronto. We're going to get to that in a second. So if I go back to my slides here, what is going to happen if we do something like this, which I want to show you next? So let's say we have this same array, Cairo, Tehran, Beijing, and Madrid in this particular example. If you look really, really carefully here, what I'm doing is I'm destructuring two values out of this array. So very, very similar to what we just saw with Vancouver, Mexico City, right? But in this case, what's happening is you can see right here, right at the beginning part here, I actually just have a comma with no variable to the left of it. Okay, so this is not a typo. This is actually a feature of destructuring. Now, sometimes this is used, it's a bit confusing, but the way to really think about this is effectively kind of what I have with the arrows and symbols over here. We're saying skip the first value in the array. We don't even want to give it a name because we don't need it in this case, but I do want the second value Tehran in this case, which is going to be the string Tehran. Okay, so we're saying destructure cities into these variables, and I don't want the first value. Okay, so if we log out Tehran, we would get that actual string, which is the second item or index 1 inside of the cities array. So let's take a look at this. So if I took out Vancouver, okay, and I just did this, right? And I said, I don't want the first value, and I comment out line 8 here, just so it doesn't crash. What we're saying here in kind of plain English is, please kind of destructure cities. I don't actually want the first value, but I want the second value, and I want to assign it to a variable called Mexico City. Okay, and I'm not really worrying about the other values right now. You can kind of throw them away. So if I run this, what we'll see is just Mexico City gets printed out as we would kind of expect. Okay, so just kind of a shorthand syntax to be able to skip values, so we don't have to like make up throwaway names, for example, like don't use or something, right? Like we don't have to make up names just to get rid of it. We can just like not assign it anything, right? In other languages, people do things like this where they give it like an underscore, or they give it like an underscore, right? Or other different kinds of variable names, but we can kind of avoid that, and we can just kind of not give it anything. And the destructuring syntax in JavaScript knows automatically to skip that value. Okay, cool. So the next thing is kind of like, what happens if we're missing a value? So let's take that previous example, right? And let's just shorten the array so it's really, really simple to see what's going on. We have only Cairo and Tehran, okay, in this cities example. We're doing the same thing. So we're saying destructure cities, right, which is what the square bracket syntax is. So whatever's on the right-hand side, destructure it into these variables on the left-hand side. We want to skip the first value. And then we want the second value to be assigned to Tehran, the variable Tehran, which is going to be the string Tehran, right? Which is what we see here. So that's good. We're good to go. But now we're also saying, please give us a third variable. But this doesn't really make sense, right? Because this cities array has 2 items in it, but we're trying to destructure 3 things out of it. So what are we going to get? What are we going to get right here? Okay. So just to kind of show you what happens here, for really quick example sake, I'm just going to cut these out just so I can put them back in a second. And I'm going to put third city, right? I'm going to console.log out third city. Okay. I want you to think, what might third city be? Is our program going to crash? Is it going to be something else? Let's take a look. Okay, so we get undefined. Okay, hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, maybe you'd expect it to crash, maybe you'd expect it to be null, but what we're seeing here is that third city is basically trying to tell us like there's nothing here, right? Undefined. Very similar if we try to access an element at the end of an array that doesn't exist. That's actually what's happening right here. We're basically trying to say third city is equal to cities at 2, right? And if we do this syntax in JavaScript, we actually don't crash. It kind of gracefully recovers and gives us back undefined. Okay, cool. So we get undefined if we try to destructure something that doesn't exist. That's pretty great. Let me put back my cities right here. And now you can probably imagine that if I try to actually log this out, our third city is going to be Toronto, as we would expect. Yeah, I'll just zoom out a little bit just so that we can see a little bit more on the screen at once. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to show kind of with this array syntax is, well, this is fine, but what if we could kind of improve on this? So that's the idea of defaults. So let's take a look at this example. This is quite a bit going on, so I'll kind of explain this step by step. So we have the same cities array, Cairo and Tehran. We're saying skip the first item. We don't want that. So Cairo gets kind of ignored. And then in this case, we're saying Tehran is going to be destructured from cities. But we have this equal sign here. So what does that mean, right? So we're saying it's equal to the string t. So what this is saying kind of in plain language is that if this Tehran ends up being undefined, please give it a default value of whatever I'm assigning to it. But if it's not undefined, then just ignore this default value. Okay, so since Tehran exists here, since we have a second value in our array, cities, it's actually going to be the string Tehran, right? We're not going to see t for Tehran. However, if we look at Beijing, right, which before was undefined, now if we give it a default value of the string Beijing, right, since that's not actually in cities, right, what's going to happen is that if we actually log this out, instead of getting undefined like we got before, we're actually going to get the default value that it was assigned to because it was actually undefined initially if we didn't have the default value. Okay, so the destructuring syntax is going to be like, okay, like we don't want Beijing to be undefined in this case, so if it is undefined, I'm just going to give it this default value that you gave me. So we're actually going to see the city printed out correctly here. Okay, so just to kind of show you how this syntax works, if I was to kind of, let's do this. I'll be fancy here. I'm just gonna, I would advise you not to do this in kind of real life. I just want to show you that this really, really is possible. I want to ignore the first value. I want to show you Mexico City. I want to ignore Toronto. I want to ignore London. And then I want to grab Berlin. And then I want to say non-existent. And this will be a default value of, let's say, Dubai. Okay, so this doesn't exist, right? We don't have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't have a sixth item inside of our array. Okay, so if I console.log out non-existent, if I didn't have this equals Dubai, it would actually be undefined. So I'll show you both versions of this, right? So I'll show it to you. Third city is not defined. Yes, it's not defined. Let me get rid of that. JavaScript helping me out here. I'm still using third city somewhere, am I? Oh, I didn't save my file. There you go. We get Dubai, right? So Mexico City is coming from slot number 2, right? Index number 1. Non-existent is actually coming from a slot that doesn't exist, right? It's coming from the slot after Berlin, right? Which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th slot or index number 5, right? And we're skipping the first item, grabbing the second item, skipping the third item, skipping the fourth item, grabbing Berlin, and then grabbing non-existent. Okay, so just to really show you what's happening here, if I get rid of Dubai as a default value for that 6th value, we're actually going to get undefined again. Okay, cool. And since Berlin exists, if I try to give it a default value of, say, B, right, it's going to get ignored. If I was actually logging it out, it's going to get ignored. Let me just clear this up for us because it actually has a value that's not undefined, so we don't need to actually assign it the capital B as a backup. Perfect. Okay, So one last thing kind of with these arrays before we get to kind of a couple of other topics and then objects. Sometimes these arrays can be quite long, right? Now, I rarely use this. I just wanted to show you this for sake of completion. You can imagine that there's a whole bunch of these cities in here, right? And we only want kind of the first two, for example, or the first three or however many, but we want to be able to refer to the rest of them kind of in some other way instead of trying to grab them directly out of cities again. So if you do like the spread syntax, like ... and then any variable name, I'm just using rest as a variable name here, but it can be whatever variable name you want. Then you can actually get back an array of the rest of the values that come after that point that you stop asking for variables. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. So if we take this same example, and instead of trying to skip a bunch of stuff here, what I'll do is I'll do ... and I'll show you the variable name doesn't matter. I'll say the rest. Okay, and if I try to console.log out the rest, so this syntax is saying ignore the first value, which is Vancouver. I want the second value, which is Mexico City, and then you can assign that to Mexico City. And then I want whatever the rest is put into this variable, the rest, which is going to be an array of the resulting variables or values. So we're going to get an array with Toronto, London, and Berlin. Okay. Let's take a look at that. So we get Mexico City for Mexico City, and we get Toronto, London, and Berlin for the rest, right? It's going to be an array because it could be many values. All right. So definitely less used. This, I really can't see myself using this too much in kind of real practice. There are some kind of maybe exceptional cases where it might come up, or you might see it in other people's code. Generally, what you'll see is kind of this syntax once in a while, or just explicitly it's pulling out everything inside of that array. Or it might be skipping values. So you might only pull out the first two, and you'll kind of ignore the rest. You won't even have a variable for that, right? Okay. So just to show you kind of how powerful this is, and this kind of is going to hint at where we see for of loops, and as well as kind of a little bit of that function syntax to some degree. What we can do is that this syntax actually works with these other iterables as well. So strings, sets, and maps. So just like we saw with the spread operator, we can actually destructure out of these iterables, just like we destructured out of the array that we just saw. Okay, so the syntax is still the same. We kind of have this array notation on the left-hand side of the equal sign. And on the right-hand side, we have the iterable. So previously that was an array, right? But in this case, you can see that I have a string on the right-hand side, right? And we know that if we try to do like a for of loop, for example, over a string, we're going to get each letter. So the same thing is true here, right? If we console.log out letter 1 and letter 2, which we destructured out of the string hello friend, we're going to get the capital H and then the lowercase e. Okay. So let's take a look at sets. If we have a new set and we call it numbers and we add these two numbers to the set, and remember sets are just kind of a unique array basically. If we try to destructure out the first two values from that set, we will get, in this case, the 5 put into 5 and the 10 put into 10, right? In this case, I forgot to put the 5. I just realized that. Okay, so that's for sets. And this syntax right here that we see is going to be pretty common, specifically kind of this, this part. For things like sets, or maybe even for strings, it's less of the case. We're going to use it a lot for arrays. We're going to also use it for maps, and as soon as we're going to see objects. So for maps, we have something like this, right? Same thing as a set. And in this case, a map has keys and values. So we're going to add these two keys and values, apple of 25, banana of 100. Very similar to an object, but it's a very different kind of concept. And we're going to destructure out two values from this, right? Apple and banana. So if you think of how we actually, in the for of loop video, use the for of loop to loop over a map object, very similar to how we use a for of loop to loop over a set object in the set video, you'll probably realize that we're going to get back an array from a map, right? For each of these values, because we're actually having key value pairs for each of those kind of destructured values because they come as a pair. Okay, so sets and arrays and strings are all kind of one value at a time, but for maps, it kind of everything comes as a pair, key and a value, right? So we're going to get back an array of those key value pairs as we kind of loop through or as we destructure them in this case. Okay, wonderful. So I think that should be good enough for examples for these. I don't want to belabor the point too much with code examples, but I do want to get into kind of this topic, which is going to come up all the time alongside the actual array syntax. These are less used, but it's important to know that they exist because they do come up once in a while. Arrays and objects are really the big ones here. So let's get to objects. So let's say that we have this object right here. Okay, and I apologize for the very, very spread out object. I just wanted the arrows to kind of not clutter each other up and kind of line up nicely with the slide. Okay, please don't make your variables look like this or your objects look like this in your actual code. That would be pretty troll. So for this object, we have an object called movie. Okay, and it has 4 properties. Title of Dune, year of 2021, length of 155, and book, which is true. Okay, and very, very similar to what we had with an array, right? We're going to take on the right-hand side the object in this case. And on the left-hand side, instead of using square brackets, right, to destructure out what's inside that movie object, we're going to use curly brackets because this is an object. Movie is an object. It is not an array. Okay, so we have to match the destructuring syntax with the left-hand side, which is going to be the object syntax, which is the curly brackets. This also is very different from arrays because the matching that happens here is actually going to match on the key names. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time because it's super important. The matching is not by position for object destructuring, it is by the key names. Okay, because there's really no such thing as an ordering for an object technically. Everything is just key value pairs. So what we're saying here is please destructure out from movie the title. So this is going to be giving us the value for the title key. The year, give us the value for the year key. The length, give us the value for the length key. And then book, which is the value for the book key. Right, so if you, as you can imagine, all of those values, if we try to print those out down here, we would get actually the associated values for those keys inside of the movie object, which was destructured. Okay, now I use the same names here. And generally speaking, when you're actually coding, you probably would use something like this to actually get those things out because this reads really, really nicely. Even if I didn't show you kind of this object right here, if you kind of just looked at this line of code, you could probably deduce from good variable naming, right, that, you know, maybe some of these things, what they might be. Okay, so let's take a look at that in code. So if I create a new file, I'll just call this objects-intro.js. And just for the sake of example, I'm just going to use this same kind of movie object so you don't have to watch me type too much. So I'll just do const movie, and I'll say Dune, one of my favorite movies that came out recently. And in this case, we have, again, 4 properties. Okay. This is an object of regular vanilla JavaScript object, 4 properties, title of Dune, year 2021, length 155, book of true. These are all also primitive types. All right, so if I want to destructure these out, check this out. So I'm going to say this is equal to movie. Now, if I just do book, okay, if we did this with an array, the order would matter, right? So this would actually be the first thing inside of the object on the, or inside of the array on the right. But since we're matching on key names, we can actually use any order that we want, right? So if I console.log out book, what we would expect to see is the value associated with the book key inside of the movie object, which is true. So let's see what we get. So I'm going to run node objects.js, and we indeed get true. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This is definitely tricky because if you misspell it or you have the wrong kind of capitalization in there, then it's going to kind of really mess you up when it comes to destructuring out of an object. This has happened to me countless times where I think a property exists in there and I actually end up not destructuring it out correctly. So just be aware these names have to match the property names. All right, so what happens if you mess it up? right? Let's take a look at this example. Let's say that we're grabbing the same object, so same movie object, right? I haven't changed it here. We're grabbing title, year, and then we're grabbing rating. Okay, so you can see that title exists, year exists, but rating doesn't exist inside of this object, right? So we're actually going to get undefined. Okay, so as you can imagine, if I try to access, so if we look at this, if I say, let's log out movie.rating, right? Even if I don't try any destructuring or anything, I would expect that to be undefined, right? Because it doesn't exist, right? So similarly, if I try to grab rating from here, and I try to console.log out the rating itself, we would expect that to be undefined because it's effectively trying to do this, line 12, and it's actually going to grab nothing because that key doesn't exist. So we're going to get undefined for rating. Okay. And just to really kind of hammer this home, let's just say I do book like this in all caps, and then I do book like this, right? Book is a key. But what you can see is, rating is undefined. Get rid of that one. What you can see is that that's still undefined, right? So the casing does matter with variable names. So be really, really careful with this, right? Even if I do something like this, that's also going to be undefined. It has to match exactly. Okay, perfect. Hope that is pretty clear for a missing value being undefined, just like with arrays. Now to fix this, we can actually give things a default value, which is really, really nice. Okay, so in this example, same one as before, we can give things a default value using the equal sign inside the destructuring syntax. So for example, here we're saying grab title out of movie, grab year out of movie, and if it doesn't exist, give it 2000 by default, grab rating out of movie, and if it doesn't exist, give it 83 by default. So in this case, we will not get undefined for rating. We'll get the number 83, but you can see that year is not going to be 2000 because it did exist, so we didn't actually need to assign it the kind of backup default value of 2000, right? So to kind of fix this situation, what we could say is we could say rating is equal to like 83. Okay, and then if I run this, you can see that for the destructuring syntax, I get 83 printed out, right? Which is just the variable rating, right? But if I try to grab rating directly off the movie object, it doesn't exist. It's still undefined, okay? Because we're not changing the movie object here, right? We are only trying to assign to a new variable things that we're pulling out of the movie object, and it's going to be assigned a new value if that doesn't exist. Okay, so we're not manipulating the object here, which is why it's still undefined on line 12, but rating is going to be an actual number. All right, cool. So one last thing with these objects, they also have a rest property. Now, again, I really would not recommend you to do this. I just want to put this here for sake of completion because it is kind of useful to know. And if you do see this pop up in other people's code, it's useful to kind of see. Unlike an array, the result will actually be an object, which is kind of nice, I guess, depending on what you actually need it for, but the syntax is actually the same. So for example, if I wanted to just say ... the rest, just to make sure that it's very clear that this can be any variable name, right? And I try to console.log out the rest instead of rating, what we'll actually see is an object that has everything that was not pulled out initially in everything that came before it. All right. So in this case, we're saying pull out book, which is true, and then just kind of dump the rest into this rest variable, which is going to be all of these three key value pairs, which is what we see here: title, due, year 2021, and length of 155. Okay, now again, less used for sure, but just nice to know at the back of your head if you do see it pop up in code, or for some reason you have an exceptional case that might need to use this. And in this case, movie.rating is still undefined. Okay, so really quick, just to kind of recap all that, destructuring really just helps us pull out values from an object or from an array or even from an iterable like we saw with sets, strings, and maps. We're going to see the syntax a lot because it's much more concise than trying to pull it out one at a time. You can kind of do it all in one line. We can also do really nice things like give it default values, which does definitely come in handy, or even skip values sometimes. Okay, that kind of latter one, we're going to actually see quite a lot, for example, with something like React on the front end. I did mention that there were kind of these other options with destructuring. We will see these a lot, but hopefully you can imagine how these might work. We can even probably do a couple exercises on these. We can destructure inside of a for of loop where we're doing const something of something. We can use a destructuring syntax there. And then same for function parameters. We can actually destructure whatever gets passed in the parameters directly, so we can kind of assign them values inside of the parameter list instead of having to do it inside the body of the function. Okay, so I would guess that if you understand the concepts for arrays and objects, I really don't think these need specific explanation, because when you do see them, as long as you understand conceptually what is happening with destructuring and how it works for both arrays and objects, or iterables as well, it will make quite a lot of sense when you actually see it happen in the real world, and especially as you start using it. So that said, I hope that this was instructive and useful for you and you found it valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. As well, I'd love to hear in the comments if you do use this destructuring syntax a lot, or you prefer to use kind of the older syntax where you actually sign things one at a time. Do you use this in React a lot, for example? Does this help kind of make sense of what's happening over there? In the next video, we're going to kind of do what I mentioned, which is go through a couple of exercises for this, because it can actually get quite hairy pretty quickly, and potentially also throw in a couple of exercises so we can actually take a look at some of these things in action as well. I can't wait to get to those exercises. I'll see you there.